Did you know Benito Mussolini put an end to the existence of Inter Milan? And the only reason why AC Milan is called what it is because of the fascist leader? What led to the breakup of AC Milan and Inter Milan in that restaurant behind the Duomo is fascinating in itself. But what is even more fascinating is the lesser known ways these two clubs remain connected. We'll look at this separation and these connections in what can probably be considered the greatest breakup in history. 8th of May, 1898, the most important day in Italian football history. As seen here in this Corriere dello Sport article from 125 years ago. Prima gara, the first game. Only difference is this isn't the first game of the day. This is the first game in the 125-year history of Italian football. But why does what was happening on this day in Turin matter to either of the Milan clubs? Well, in that first match, representing Internazionale Torino was a player, the first ever English player to play abroad, a midfielder by the name of Herbert Kilpin. Kilpin would make the final of the first ever Italian football championship, but he would end up losing to Genoa Cricket and Football Club in added time. However, 3 years later, almost to the day, in May of 1901, Kilpin exacts revenge on Genoa, beating them in the final 3-0. But this time, it's not with Internazionale Torino, but instead a team founded by Kilpin himself, eventually called AC Milan. Founded as Milan Football and Cricket Club in 1899, there's some debate about the precise date of establishment of the team. However, since the club's charter was essentially lost, you can decide for yourself if you're Team December 13th or Team December 16th. A pretty successful club in its first decade, Milan Football and Cricket Club went on to lift 3 Italian championships inside 8 years of being founded. However, trouble in the organization started after their 3rd championship. See, sometime in 1907, a growing faction of the 44-member Milan Football Club were growing unhappy by the domination in the organization by Italian players. And after the discussions reached a deadlock, a splinter group of mostly Italian and Swiss players left Milan Football Club. While meeting at the Orologio restaurant behind the Duomo, 15 people gather, and after a 3-hour discussion, make it official on this piece of paper. The members put down their signatures and unanimously call the organization Football Club Internazionale Milano, translating to International Milan, a name highlighting the very difference from Milan Football and Cricket Club, birthing one of the most intense rivalries in world football. Conveniently for Inter, one of the founding club members, Giorgio Muggiani, was a painter, and he designed the club's first crest, with the letters FCIM intertwined with the club's colors. Even as a Milanista, I have to say that crest, designed in 1908, that was a thing of beauty. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'll be calling the two clubs by their present-day short names, Milan for AC Milan and Inter for Inter Milan. Simply put, Inter Milan was a club supported by Milan's elite, while AC Milan's support base was said to be primarily working class. So much so that Milan wasn't always nicknamed Rossoneri. Instead, the blue-collar influence on that team was seen in their first nickname, Kasciavit, which translates to the screwdrivers. As highlighted in this article, from its beginnings, Inter had a more cosmopolitan reputation and became associated with more well-heeled audience. In its early days, the side was nicknamed Boscia, a Milanese term meaning braggart, one who boasts about possessions, to reflect their supposed snooty bourgeois credentials. Now, emulating their cousins, Inter won their first Italian championship, called Scudetto, within 2 years of the club's formation, led by captain Virgilio Fossati. However, on Christmas Day in 1916, with the First World War at its peak, Inter's captain Fossati died in Monfalcone in a battle between the Italian and Austrian armies. During the fascist era, the ruling party forced Inter to merge with Unione Sportiva Milanese. Now, one would think, why would the fascists care about a football club out of Milan? Well, Milan was one of the breeding grounds of support for Mussolini. See, Mussolini had a tendency to use football as a propaganda tool. Internazionale Milan, or International Milan, a club promoting bringing in outsiders, going against the Italian-centric idea. That name and philosophy made the ruling fascist party very uneasy. They forced that merger and demanded that the word Inter be dropped from the name, renaming them Società Sportiva Ambrosiana. You would think that Milan's pro-Italian ideologies would spare them from any alterations made by Mussolini. Well, think again. In 1919, Milan went through a name change. Milan Football and Cricket Club became just Milan Football Club. But the club chose to use the city's English name, Milan, instead of the Italian name, Milano. In 1939, the fascist regime imposed an Italianized name. Milan Football Club was far too English for their liking, so they changed it to Associazione Calcio Milano. In 1945, the end of the Second World War saw the death of Benito Mussolini and the birth of a new future for the two Milan clubs. After going through a few name changes, the end of the ruling fascist regime in Italy resulted in Associazione Sportiva Ambrosiana Inter being able to revert back to its original name, Internazionale, while Milan only partly abandoned their name. Instead of ending with Milano, the club called itself Associazione Calcio Milan, or simply AC Milan. Going back to 1909, a year after Inter broke away, Milan saw their first change of ownership when Piero Pirelli, son of Giovanni Pirelli, became the new owner and chairman of the club. He was in charge for 19 years, a record time span only beaten 80 years later by Silvio Berlusconi. However, Piero Pirelli left a mark even Silvio Berlusconi couldn't: the San Siro. Yes, both Milan and Inter rent the San Siro from the municipality of Milan, but that wasn't always the case. The stadium was initially built and owned by AC Milan. Piero Pirelli was a huge fan of English football, and he wanted a stadium built in the style of the English, designed purely for football and without an athletics track. Built in a record time of 13 months, the San Siro eventually saw Inter move in 1947 from Arena Civica, where the Nerazzurri had been playing since 1930. In 1935, the municipality of Milan bought the San Siro and started the process of renting it to the Rossoneri, and eventually the Nerazzurri, a stadium that was eventually named after Inter legend Giuseppe Meazza, who also played 2 seasons with Milan. Decades after Piero left a mark with Milan, his tire company Pirelli eventually became Inter's main shirt sponsor for 27 years, a period that saw Inter amass 20 major footballing trophies. The sharing of the same stadium gradually intensified the rivalry between Milan and Inter, and eventually the social differences between the two sets of fans became more apparent in the nicknames they were given. Inter supporters became known as Motoretta, as they were able to travel to the ground on motor scooters, while their Milan counterparts, Tramvis, as they had to rely on public transport. The so-called Derby della Madonnina got its name from one of the city's principal attractions. When you hear Milan, you think the Duomo. On top of the cathedral is a beautiful gold statue of the Virgin Mary, referred to in English as Little Madonna, and in Italian as Madonnina. On the field, the rivalry between the two teams was so intense that, according to some, it continued on the Italian national team, where 2 players from Milan and Inter would often not play together. At times, one would usually substitute the other at about halftime. It was following the Second World War that Italian clubs looked at football from more of a professional standpoint than as a sport. It was during this transition that 2 iconic coaches arrived at the 2 Milan clubs: Nereo Rocco for the Rossoneri and Helenio Herrera for the Nerazzurri. And the one commonality between these 2 coaches' style of play: the backline-focused, ultra-defensive Catenaccio, a style of play which translates in English to door bolt. Often mistaken to have been born in Italy, Catenaccio is a system that comes from Switzerland. In Italy, this system was pioneered by the 2 Milan coaches in the 60s, which saw a highly successful decade for both the Milan clubs. The 60s was a period of what you can do, I can do better. The Catenaccio approach saw Milan lift the 1961-62 Scudetto. A couple of young stars on that side were Gianni Rivera and Jose Altafini. The next season in 1963, AC Milan became the first team in Italian history to win the European Cup, now known as the Champions League. Led by their captain and a first in a name that became synonymous with Milan for years to come, Cesare Maldini. However, the rest of the 60s saw Milan take a bit of a backseat to the dominance of Inter. The same year that Milan lifted the European Cup, Herrera's Inter lifted their first Scudetto under his leadership, and they took no time to become the second Italian team to win the European Cup, lifting the trophy the very next season, beating 7-time finalists Real Madrid in the final. The Nerazzurri then went back-to-back, lifting the trophy again in 1965, this time against Eusebio's Benfica. Now, one might wonder, why are the 60s called the Mazzola Connection? Remember, the dominance of Inter's 60s were led by their star man, Sandro Mazzola, but Milan too had a Mazzola in their squad. Remember the young Brazilian along with Gianni Rivera, Jose Altafini? He was given the nickname Mazzola as a young player because his teammates felt he resembled the playing style of Italian attacker Valentino Mazzola. Valentino Mazzola, who outside of being a Torino legend, also happened to be the father of Inter's Sandro Mazzola. The exhausting 60s saw a slowed down 70s. Both Milan and Inter picked up only one Serie A title the entire decade. Although the 70s did see the arrival of the Baresi brothers in the history books of both the clubs. Giuseppe Baresi joined Inter in 1976, went on to lift 2 Serie A titles and a UEFA Cup, playing over 400 matches for Inter over the course of 16 years. While his brother Franco Baresi joined Milan a year later in 1977 and went on to lift 6 Serie A titles, 3 Champions League trophies in a career spanning 20 years with over 700 appearances. Baresi went on to become the first player in AC Milan history to have his shirt number 6 retired by the club. The two brothers took this iconic picture from the 1979-80 season during the Milan derby. Now, the 80s for Milan kicked off with an absolute bang, and by a bang I mean more of an implosion. While Inter lifted their 12th Scudetto, disaster struck for Milan. 1980 saw one of the first of, unfortunately, too many Italian football scandals, the Totonero Scandal. So in 1946, Italy introduced state-run football betting. For a fan to win a bet, they had to accurately pick the outcome of 12 matches. Even Bernie Madoff would look at that and say, come on guys, let's be fair here. But that was it, the only way for fans to bet, which gave rise to illegal betting. A couple of guys ran a syndicate from their restaurant in Rome, Lazio players frequented that restaurant, and before you know it, they decided to fix games in exchange for a cut. The outcomes didn't go exactly as planned, so the two guys running the syndicate, well, they went to the public prosecutor, and it was all over. The incredible part is that the players and those involved were acquitted of all charges because there was no law against match fixing in Italy at that time. Milan chairman Felice Colombo was involved, and the Rossoneri, for the first time in their history, were relegated to Serie B. For Inter, the 80s kicked off with a very different kind of bang, the Serie A title. They also closed off the 80s with a Scudetto, this time led by German duo of Andy Brehme and Lothar Matthäus, and eventually the addition of Jurgen Klinsmann. While the 80s for Milan was simply a decade of two halves. The first half of the decade, Milan won more Serie B titles than they had won Serie A titles in the past 15 years. There were repeat failures on the pitch, and that translated off the pitch into the accounting books, with the club in intense financial difficulties, teetering on bankruptcy. And then the second half of the decade kicked in, bringing in a change of such a proportion that it forever changed AC Milan. And that was kicked off with the arrival of Silvio Berlusconi. The duo of Berlusconi and his right-hand man and Milan managing director Adriano Galliani brought in the Dutch trio of Van Basten, Rijkaard, and Gullit, along with Italian additions like Ancelotti, Donadoni, and Galli. These high-profile moves were initially overshadowing the rise of a future leader at Milan, and that was of Paolo Maldini. 5 years after winning their second Serie B title, 2 years after the arrival of Berlusconi, Milan won their 11th Serie A title in 1988, only to back it up with their third European Cup in 1989. This European triumph made Paolo Maldini and Cesare Maldini the first father and son duo to win the European Cup in its history. While researching and putting this piece together, it has truly amazed me how many similar trajectories these two clubs have had. If the 80s was a tale of two halves for Milan, the 90s was so for Inter. The first half of the 90s saw poor results in the Serie A, with 1994 being a near disaster, as the Nerazzurri dodged relegation by 1 point. The only club still in Serie A history to never have gotten relegated to Serie B. Although in Europe, Inter did lift 3 UEFA Cups in the 90s. Just like Milan in 1986, Inter saw a new owner take over in 1995 in Massimo Moratti. The Italian businessman came in to give the Nerazzurri hope for a renewed future, and he put his money where his mouth was by breaking the world record transfer fee twice in the late 90s. First in 1997 for Ronaldo, a record fee of £17 million, and then in 1999 for Christian Vieri from Lazio for £31 million. And just like Berlusconi's tenure started with the rise of Paolo Maldini, Moratti's tenure started with the rise of an Inter legend in Javier Zanetti. Although, in spite of his high spending, Inter had a dull 90s, which to date is the only decade the Nerazzurri haven't won a Serie A title. Continued success for Moratti would come later in his ownership, in contrast with the quick success seen by Silvio Berlusconi, whose AC Milan kicked off the 90s the way they exited the 80s, by becoming back-to-back European Cup champions in 1989 and then again in 1990, a record that stood for 27 years before Real Madrid went back-to-back in 2017. Now, Milan's decade of the 90s could be an entire episode on its own. In contrast with Inter's only decade without a Serie A title, the 90s could be considered Milan's most winningest decade in club history. A decade that saw the Rossoneri win 5 Serie A titles and 2 Champions League titles, including 4 finals appearances with a total of 15 trophies. And like Inter saw the arrival of star strikers like Ronaldo and Vieri at the end of the 90s, Milan saw the arrival of their own talisman in Ukrainian forward Andriy Shevchenko. The 2000s kicked off with Milan the dominant side in the league and in Europe, showing that dominance in a 6-0 thrashing of Inter in the Derby della Madonnina in 2001, a result that saw fans vandalize Christian Vieri and Fabio Cannavaro's restaurants in Milan. The next high-profile meeting between the two clubs took place in the semi-final of the Champions League in 2003, the first time the two clubs met each other in that round of the competition, with Milan making it past Inter to eventually lift their 6th Champions League title. It was that match that saw one of the most iconic derby pictures ever taken. Milan would go on to win 1 more Scudetto before Massimo Moratti's Inter would take over the league, winning 4 Serie A titles in a row, 5 if we count the one given after Calciopoli. The Rossoneri did pick up their 7th Champions League title during Inter's dominance during the league, only for the Nerazzurri to close off the decade with the most historic season a Serie A side has ever had. See, after a period dominated by the brilliance of Zlatan Ibrahimovic along with his teammates, coached under Roberto Mancini, Moratti over the course of a couple seasons made some big changes. The hiring of Jose Mourinho and the sale of Zlatan Ibrahimovic to Barcelona in exchange for Samuel Eto'o. These moves, alongside the high-profile signings of Wesley Sneijder and Diego Milito, were a masterstroke. Although Mourinho's first season saw him get eliminated in the first round of the Champions League, his second season with the new additions saw Inter pull off an iconic win at the Camp Nou, beating defending champions Barcelona in the semi-final to play Bayern in the final, which is where comes the number 22 connection. It's fair to say, Milan would not have won their 7th Champions League trophy had it not been for their icon who wore the number 22 shirt, Kaká. The Brazilian guided Milan to their 7th European title and ended up winning the Ballon d'Or in the process. And for Inter fans, the Nerazzurri wouldn't have lifted their Champions League trophy had it not been for their number 22 in Diego Milito, who scored a brace in the final against Bayern. Incredibly, Milito, who scored 30 goals in the season, winning a treble, did not even get on the shortlist for a Ballon d'Or. And by winning the Scudetto, the Coppa Italia, and the Champions League in a single season, Inter completed the treble, becoming the first ever Italian team to achieve that feat. For Milan and Inter, the 2010s epitomized the similar trajectory the two clubs have almost always maintained. Both teams went through what fans would call their own banter eras. Both Milan and Inter saw their long-term owners in Berlusconi and Moratti give up their ownership. Both clubs went through 3 owners in the decade. For Inter, the banter era came to a close with their 19th Serie A title in 2021, 11 years after their previous Scudetto. The next season, falling behind on the Scudetti count, AC Milan pulled through to lift their own 19th Serie A title in 2022. And just like Inter, 11 years after their previous title win. And not only are these two teams tied on the number of Scudetti, but also on the number of times they have been runners-up, with both finishing second 16 times. Now, at some point in time, one of the Milan clubs will go ahead, win their 20th Serie A title, add that second star on the shirt. But I can assure you one thing, the other club will be right behind, adding their own second star in no time. Because ever since the great split happened in 1908, time and time again, from the looks of it, every decade, there's something or the other that always seems to connect these two historic organizations to each other.